Hello and welcome to The Price of Football, the show that looks at the money behind the beautiful game with me, Kevin Day, and Liverpool University's Kieran Maguire. It's Doctor Who timey-wimey time again because it's Friday, it's interview day, but really it's Tuesday evening. We've just done the last pod and got quite sentimental about a lovely message we had from a listener. Now, loads of things could have happened in the last 2 days, made us angry and furious rather than sentimental, but here we are. And we have I was unable to attend. For once, I had work reasons for not being able to do this interview because lo and behold, the phone rang and I didn't recognise the number. It was my agent. And we had a lovely chat. We introduced each other. We started on surname terms initially, but so I couldn't do it. So Kieran did this interview with Ian Graham, his former head of research at Liverpool Football Club. And a very interesting interview it is.
Ian, thanks so much for coming on the show. Before we go into perhaps the details of what you're doing now and your role at Liverpool, can you sort of give us an indication as to how you ended up in football in the first place?
Yeah, sure. It's a story of luck, really, as a lot of things in football are. I was working as a postdoctoral researcher, working on polymer physics, which is very interesting but very difficult career choice. And my partner worked at the Cambridge Exam Board at the time. Her boss spotted an advert in a sort of academic jobs board saying, "Do you want to study football statistics for a living?" I had no idea such a thing was possible. Wasn't particularly happy with my career choice. So I applied for the job and got it. And it really was right at the start of when data started becoming widely available in football. So yeah, when I started, the data really wasn't there to say very much. So yeah, a bit of luck that I saw the advert, and then the timing was also quite lucky because data started arriving just after I started working with football data.
Cool. And how did that lead to Liverpool?
The company I worked for was called Decision Technology. They still are called Decision Technology. Their main job is like behavioural psychology. So they run experiments about helping banks optimise the interest rate on credit cards, or telling Tesco the best place to put their expensive bottles of wine to make sure more consumers buy the wine. And football was a bit of a sideshow for them. My boss there, Henry, used it as an advert, really, just to show what could be done with data analysis. We did publish a weekly column in the Times called The Think Tank. Danny Finkelstein would crack a few jokes about recent football news, and then we'd look at the statistical story behind whatever was happening, whether it was England's failure to qualify for an international tournament, or home advantage, or substitutions, things like that. Through that, Damien Comolli got in touch. He was director of football at Tottenham Hotspur at the time. So we consulted for Spurs for 5 years. Damien then ended up as director of football at Liverpool. We looked into whether we could work together. Unfortunately, Damien left Liverpool just as I was offered the job there. So yeah, Liverpool all came through us doing a newspaper column with the Times. That would have been 7 years before I joined Liverpool.
Right. Cool. I imagine the hours are quite long in terms, because looking at the amount of data that you got to produce and understand and then presumably put out into some form of output document. I know from what I do, it does become all consuming. Well, did it burn you? Did it was sort of, or for me, I always say, as an academic, what I do is a glorified hobby, so I don't count it as a job, so it never bothers me.
Yeah, there is definitely an element of it not counting as a job. If it was insurance premiums rather than expected goals that I was looking at, I might sort of resent the time I was spending a little bit more. It is something that I'm fundamentally fascinated by. So yeah, it never quite feels like work. In terms of the hours, we were lucky in some ways because we didn't have the same schedule as the team. So we didn't have to go to away games, didn't have to kind of deliver results immediately after nighttime kickoffs. Everyone was happy for us to just deliver the results the next morning. So we were a bit more 9 to 5 than the first team was. But the sort of downside of that was when the first team goes off on holiday for 6 weeks, that's when all our real work happens. So first of all, the transfer window opens, and second of all, the hundreds of things we've been asked to do during the season. Well, off season is our only chance to get that stuff done. Eventually, we got to a place where everything was automated. So the data came in, the computer processed it, and it was just available the next morning. So the sort of crunch times were only when that process went wrong. We get up at 7 o'clock the next morning and find that nothing has been processed. That does occasionally happen. But we did get to a place where things were automated, and with the sheer volume of data that's available these days, you need to automate these things because there aren't enough hours in the day otherwise.
You're absolutely right. I mean, we had Swiss Ramble, who is the guru of football finance, and he says that he automates all of his football finance data. I'm not very good with the computer, so I still do all of my stuff by hand.
Yeah, I've seen your spreadsheet, and it's terrifying.
It's terrible as well. I mean, it's just one giant data dump, which, and I know what it all means, but the number of hours that I've had to put into it, but ludicrous. So to have some system. You mentioned XG, and you mentioned you've now got so much data. How do you what skills do you need to be successful in terms of understanding and putting out something and being able to advise clubs that this is what you should be looking for, because there must be a danger of drowning in numbers?
Yeah, so there's two dangers. One is too much information, drowning in numbers, as you say, and the other is with football data, it's very, very easy to come to the wrong conclusions. So you've got to be really careful with the analysis, and you've got to have. I like it to be theory driven. So it's not just here's some data, let's find some interesting patterns in the data. That's not the right way to approach the problem. You should approach the problem with how do we think football works, and can the data tell us something about whether our ideas about how football works are correct or incorrect. So at Liverpool, all of our models were sort of directed at one particular question. So for understanding performance analysis of players, it was how does this player's actions increase or decrease the chance of scoring a goal? How do their actions increase or decrease the chance of conceding a goal? And that, by asking that question, that leads you to a different sort of analysis. We're not just throwing number of passes into a regression and looking at its correlation with outcome, because having possession is important, but it's not all important, as Manchester City found out last week when it was a game of attack versus defence for 45 minutes. And then the other thing is, as you rightly mentioned, is drowning in numbers. So there are so many metrics available today. There's something called, I've written about it in my book, and now I can't remember the name of it. The basic idea is when you've got a large number of metrics, someone's going to look really good or really bad on one of those metrics just through chance. And so I think I've seen this happen a few times. There's a player that a manager likes and wants to sign, and now he's got the he's got the ability to use data to help him. He just looks through metrics until he sees, my player is number one on this metric. Now this metric's the most important metric for me, even though today's the first day I've ever heard about it. And so again, by going away from that and just asking a more basic question, which is, how is this player actually impacting the game in terms of scoring chance and conceding chance, that sort of keeps you safely away from the data mining approach of just sort of digging around metrics until we find one we like the look of.
Yes, I can imagine. How difficult was it to persuade other people at the football club to buy into what you're doing? Because football, in my observation, is a very, very conservative industry. It doesn't like change. People are fearful of new ideas because this might impact my job, this might impact my status within the club. You must have gone, and you worked closely with Michael Edwards, didn't you, at Liverpool. You must have come up against barriers to, you're a bunch of nerds, you don't know what you're talking about, show me your medals. Was that, or was it a sort of an iterative process? Did you have a big win when you spoke about you were very keen on Philippe Coutinho, for example, in the book? And on the back of that, did that assist you in terms of building up the credibility of the amazing work that you've undertaken?
Yeah, I think the story you've summarised there is what most nerds who make the mistake of going to work for a football club experience. I was very lucky in my journey because I didn't experience it to anywhere near that extent. So I always had the luxury that the boss insisted that things work this way. So Damien Camoli had spent some time in America when he was growing up, was a baseball fan. He knew about Moneyball and the whole Billy Bean and the Oakland A's story well before it was popular. And so he was actively looking for something equivalent in football. Something equivalent in football really didn't exist. It was literally the first ever version of a player rating system that I invented. Went to Damien Camoli and he started using it. It wasn't a tried and tested thing as it was in baseball. So we had Damien, and after Damien left, Daniel Levy at Spurs insisted that it was part of the decision-making process. And one of my reasons of going to Liverpool was John Henry and had proved that he would insist on a similar approach with the Boston Red Sox. And that's what happened at Liverpool. In terms of like the resistance to data, Michael is a convert to data, but when I first met him at Tottenham Hotspur, he was Harry Redknapp's head of video analysis. I thought he was just one of Harry's mates. And our first meeting, where I described our approach, let's just say that my ideas didn't go down very well with Michael. And the reason was he'd seen how data was used in football. He's an ex-youth footballer himself. He's worked as a video analyst in the Premier League for many years. And those video analysts, they really know the game inside out to an extent that a data person never will. And so what he'd seen was distance metrics, so how much distance is covered, and he could see it had no impact on results. And he'd seen things like pass completion percentage, number of passes made, and he could also see that didn't really tell you anything about how good a player was. It tells you something, but not much of importance. And so because he'd seen things done badly once, he was quite rightly sceptical that things could be done properly. But the data just started arriving where you could see which player was on the ball, where he was, what he did with it, what happened next. That we could, it's an imperfect view of a game because there are many factors that the data doesn't see in a game, but the data can see every game that's played in the same way, whereas a video analyst can't. So if you ask, would you prefer to see the data on a game or watch the video of a game? Even I would watch the video of the game rather than just look at the data. But it takes you 90 minutes to watch a game. So if you want to watch 1,000 games or every game a player's ever played, you just don't have the time to do it. And Michael came round to the view that the data and our analysis of the data was useful enough to give a first cut of a view of, is this player any good or not? Do we think he's world class, average for the Premier League, not good enough for the Premier League? And then his football expertise could be focused on just watching the players that were interesting, either players that he hadn't heard of before, or he didn't already know, or players that perhaps surprised him. Like our opinion of a player would be really good or really bad compared to what his prior opinion was. So he was slowly won over. But in both at both clubs, the sort of insistence came from the top. This has to be part of the process. And so even when there were clashes with coaching staff or with old school scouts at both clubs, I always had the luxury of saying, well, the boss wants this stuff, so if you don't like it, you can talk to the boss about it. Lots of other data people at clubs don't have that luxury.
I can imagine. Yes, it's a fascinating industry. I'd always say that what you do is a complement, not a substitute to what the existing scouting system does, but there is so much resistance in the game. So I think it's great that you had people who were visionary and who were willing to adapt. In terms of, you've mentioned XG and an awful lot of data, and I think it's probably fair to say that these days, with Opta, with StatsBomb, with all of these organisations around who effectively are the data miners in terms of the game, that there's an awful lot available. So how does an individual club have an edge? If everybody's using the same recipe, then everybody ends up eating the same pizza. So how do you have that edge? Are there, if and this might be giving away Ian Graham's secret sauce here, do you have, these are the three best metrics which I think are most reliable and which I would ultimately be prepared to stand or fall by?
I think pizza's a pizza, but I'd prefer to eat some pizzas than others. I think when I was starting, it was literally building this stuff from scratch. So the model that I had, I called possession value. It's also known as expected threat. Now these days, StatsBomb, Impact, there are sort of open source implementations of possession value models. Now, there are still important differences between those models. Understanding the value of having possession in a given part of the pitch in a given context, like are we under pressure or not, that's a different question to which players added this value. So rating a player is different to understanding the value of possession. But again, player ratings are becoming open source, and data providers are quite rightly giving their own player ratings. So beyond the kind of, I'd always say our algorithms are better than the opposition, but it's, they're similar algorithms. Beyond that, there's interpretation is really important, and that's what a lot of clubs get wrong, is just because a player's got high XG doesn't mean he's the player for you. So there's with XG, for example, there's no concept of what it costs to take a shot. If you take a shot, that means one of your teammates doesn't get the chance to take a shot. So if you already have a lot of players who take shots, then adding another is diminishing returns, really. So that sort of interpretation isn't included in your basic player rating. Implementation is really important. So I touched on it before. Lots of clubs have at least one data person, if not a whole data team. I'd say a very small percentage of those clubs actually use it to affect decision making, or use it consistently and honestly to affect decision making. If it's a player that we wanted to sign anyway, then we can say, yeah, the data backs up this player. If the data's not great on a player that we want to sign, we'll quietly put the report in a drawer and sign the player anyway. And then the third thing is new data is still arriving, and there is still an edge. extracting the signal from that data. So the sort of possession value models that I've talked about and the ones that StatsBomb and Impact provide as part of their service, that's all based on event data, where you see every ball touch and the player with the ball touch, and maybe some context around it, like who's pressuring the ball. For the last decade, tracking data has been available. That's where you see all of the players 25 frames per second, and workable player ratings models from tracking data are not yet a commodity in the same way that event-based possession value models are. So there is still an edge as more data becomes available, and it becomes more difficult to work with. The data's order of magnitudes larger. It kind of tells you a lot more about the game because you can see the space players are in. You can see if a player's made an off-ball run, that he might not receive a pass, but you can say, well, he did something good even if he didn't receive that pass. Building something workable, it took us years to do that at Liverpool, and I think very few clubs have got to that stage of having a workable tracking data model. And then the next generation of data is not just the coordinate of the player, but it's 29 XYZ coordinates, where you can see each joint of the player, which direction they're facing, which direction they're looking. That tells you even more about the game, but again, it's much, much harder to even ingest that data.
In terms of the type of clubs which the media associate with data, you spend a good chunk of the book, there's a good chapter about Brentford and Brighton and their approach, which has given them an edge, sort of. But ultimately, it comes down to players and budgets. This is where I look at things from a financial point of view. Do you think we could ever have another Leicester City, or ultimately we've now reached the position in football where even if you've got a fantastic data analytics division who really understand what they're doing, there's got to be a natural ceiling, and that club can, a club like Brighton or Palace or Brentford or whoever it's going to be, six is the equivalent of winning the Premier League for them.
Yeah, I think Brighton will happen again because stuff happens, let's say, in another season, or if you replay that season over and over again in a computer simulation, Leicester don't win that league many times. So, luck is part of it certainly wasn't all down to luck, and not to take anything away from Leicester's achievement. But luck is part of the reason why we love football, and a story like Leicester is part of the reason why we love football. If everyone's using data to its potential, it ceases to become an edge. I think the fact that Brentford in particular, Brighton too, but Brentford in particular, the fact that they survive and prosper in the Premier League, that tells you all you need to know about whether data is being efficiently used or not. They're a club, you'll know their finances better than I do. They're a club that can't rely on gate receipts or commercial activities. Their money comes from the fact that they're in the Premier League and they get that TV money. And so if other clubs used data to the same efficiency that they do, they shouldn't really be a Premier League club. Other clubs with financial advantages should naturally, let's say, if they use their financial advantages, be in the Premier League. And I think the sort of that efficiency, just because having worked inside clubs, that idea of efficiency is just a dream in a football club. Clubs don't operate in particularly efficient ways. So I think it will continue to be an edge.
Yeah. So it's a case of being smarter because you can't be big, and that's not no disrespect, because I've got a really good relationship with Brentford. I'm giving a talk there in a few weeks, and as a club, you've got everybody pointing in the same direction, which you will have known that at times in individual clubs, and clearly you've seen far greater relationship with clubs than I have. There's a bit of infighting taking place, and that means that you've got people not taking notice of the data, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think at Liverpool in particular, we had that similar, everyone pulling in the same direction. And I think you made the point earlier about it's not just data. And the great thing about Liverpool was we would talk to the old school scouts about data and how we saw a player. They'd talk to us about how they saw a player, and we learned from each other. All the players that ended up being successes, they were the ones where everyone agreed this is going to be a great player for the club.
Cool. One of the things I picked up from the book was your observations with regards to referees, and refereeing always a contention. I used to referee at amateur level, and I always defend referees. But you sort of infer in the book that there is unconscious bias in terms of things such as injury time and decision making and so on. Can you sort of just expand upon that?
Yeah, I think it's important to say that referees, I'm sure, have got good intentions and they try to be fair and so on. And I think it's being fair and being consistent aren't necessarily the same thing, and there are always tensions. If you were a referee yourself, you'll understand those tensions of, should I give this decision or not? In the book, the chapter that I talk about referees is a chapter about home advantage, which is a really, really strong and kind of not discussed aspect of football. It's worth like half a goal, and in a game where there's fewer than 3 goals per game, it's as big an advantage. I think I say it's worth half a Lionel Messi on your team, and who wouldn't want that? And I think a lot of that home advantage, it's not conclusive, but there's a lot of hints that the home advantage is played out through the impact of the referee. So what we saw during COVID and games behind closed doors was that home advantage decreased quite a lot. And also behind closed doors and with the introduction of VAR as well. So despite problems with the VAR, it is in some ways a more objective view than just being able to see the incident live. We've seen the penalty rates, which have always been in favour of home teams, have become more equalised between the home teams and the away teams. And then when you look at referee interventions, the more advantageous they are to the home team, the higher the home advantage. So if you look at just sort of normal fouls, there's a bit of a home advantage. But if you look at penalties given, there's a huge home advantage. Or there was in the days before lockdown and before VAR. And there has bounced back since COVID as well. So there are a lot of hints that home advantage is played out through the referees. There was a brilliant academic paper, it's more than 20 years old now, where they played some professional referees. They played a game and asked them to judge all of the foulers during a game. 2 different scenarios, one where the sound was on and one where the sound was off. And the referees just watching the game on a video recording, they displayed home advantage when the sound was on. So just the sound of the crowd, they didn't even have to be in the stadium and feel the pressure. Just the sound of the crowd booing an away tackle would lead them to give more fouls. I can't remember, it was either more fouls to the home team or fewer fouls to the away team. When the sound was off, those differences disappeared.
That's amazing. So for any fan who's listening to this, make some noise.
Yeah, I mean, the sort of the conclusion is that fans do make a difference. That home advantage, at least partly, is played through the fans.
That's right. And the other thing I think I read in that chapter was that you did this analysis, or you read a paper that has done some analysis, that when it comes to the amount of injury time that's being awarded, if the home team is winning, the referee tends to give less injury time. And if the home team is not winning, they, on average, give more. And I can assure you, I've worked with some referees and so on, and they would say, "No, that's nonsense. We don't think we do not think like that." But clearly, unconsciously, it does seep into their decision making process.
Yeah, absolutely. So this paper is by a good friend of mine, Ignacio Palacios Huerta. He's an economics professor at LSE. So so it's a serious piece of work. He looked at Spanish football and he put in any number of covariates, because you say, well, maybe it's not this, maybe it's that they're a rich club or a poor club, or maybe it's there were more fouls given to one team or another team. He looked at every possible explanation, and there was none apart from this scoreline effect. Inspired by his work, I looked at the Premier League. It was for the think tank newspaper piece, so it was more than 10 years ago, but I found exactly the same results in the Premier League. And really the smoking gun that Nacho found was that if there's a 2-goal difference, they don't give more injury time. It's only when it might change the result. So in games that aren't close, the referees become, fair again. Not that they're unfair, but they unconsciously might give an extra minute to the home team because I think, okay, the away team has wasted a little bit of time.
Wow. So those Arsenal fans who think that there's a vendetta against them and will point to John Stones' equaliser in the 98th minute, perhaps the numbers support your view, Gooners.
Yeah, I think, Arsenal's fitness coach needs to sort of wonder why in a game where they don't have to leave their own box, so many of their players are suffering from cramp. It's kind of their own fault that so much injury time is added. I could tell you, when I watch games, the analyst disappears and the rabid, emotional football fan appears. And as a Liverpool fan, when I'm watching games, I know that every single referee's got a vendetta against Liverpool. Arsenal fans know that every single referee's got a vendetta against Arsenal, and I'm sure you feel the same way about Brighton.
Yeah, not very often, because I do genuinely try to defend the referees, but yeah. I scream and abuse referees. I go, I'm supposed to be. I'm a 60+ old man. Why am I behaving like this? I'm supposed to be a grown up. But that's part of the love of football. In terms of, again, just going back to the book, and I'm not here to blow smoke up your arse, Ian, but it was an absolute page turner as far as I was concerned. Loved every minute of it. You spoke about at one stage why transfers fail. And the media is obsessed with the transfer market in a way which didn't exist 30 or 40 years ago. That's part of the fact that we've got a 24/7 rolling news cycles in terms of sports journalism and so on. What, in your opinion, are sort of the major factors when a club makes a sort of a signature statement signing? If you take a look at Barcelona, 3 100 million euro signings in Coutinho, Griezmann, and Dembele, it's fair to say that none of them particularly work. So can you identify why big signings don't necessarily succeed?
Yeah, I sort of listed some of the reasons in the book, and there are so many reasons that it shouldn't be a surprise that transfers fail, and even when you use things like data analysis or traditional scouting, or trying to understand the player from a personal point of view as well as how good a player he is. Even when you try and do the best job possible in all of those things, transfers are far from a guaranteed success. So the typical reasons that I listed in my book is like the player's not as good as we think. No one is as good as their YouTube highlights reel. The club's quite often got a player who's as good or better than the player in that position. The player doesn't fit into the team's style is a classic example. Injury problems is one that's kind of less controllable. That scuppers a lot of careers. And there can be issues with the manager not liking the player being a difficult character, and so on. Now, that list wasn't a scientific list. That was just a subjective, I've seen this stuff happen at Liverpool and at Spurs. I think Ryan O'Hanlon is an ESPN writer. I think he went through a list of transfers and kind of gave his opinion of which of these reasons it might be. So if you want the story behind which ones actually happen more often, I'd recommend his article to you. And I think, like, if I look back at Liverpool, the transfer failures in the later stages, Thiago and Naby Keita failed to hit 50% of starts for Liverpool. Those were injury issues. Going back to earlier than that, Christian Benteke was a classic example of a really good player, but one completely unsuited to Liverpool's style of play. And I think Coutinho to Barcelona is a similar sort of issue. Neymar was a sort of almost an old-fashioned pacey winger who also cut inside and helped with goal scoring as well. And Coutinho is just a very different style of player to Neymar. Personally, I thought he played perfectly well at Barcelona, but as good a player as he is, he's not Neymar. So the fans or the board lost patience with him.
Fair. You've written this book. What were the motivations? You'd worked for Liverpool for a long period of time, and I'm just curious as to you decided it was time to move on. As somebody that's been through the pain of writing a book, what were the motivations and challenges from your point of view?
Yeah, I think therapy, but therapy that I regretted going through, really dredged up some things that I would have preferred not to revisit. I think with there being more and more interest around data analysis in football, I was motivated to sort of give the real story of how it works. I think there's a lot of mysticism around data analysis in football, and there's a lot of articles saying, "Wow, these geniuses, they must be looking at X." I think they would have looked at Y, and that would have caused them to sign the player. And while working at Liverpool, you can read these articles and roll your eyes. You can't say anything about it. So I wanted to give a kind of a realistic description of this is how it actually works, and for the Liverpool players at least to say, well, this is what we thought of the Liverpool players, the reasons why we did or didn't sign various players. And I think the other side of it is to try and take away that mysticism. So the second part of the book is it's kind of like a history of data analysis in football, going through ideas from using the Poisson distribution to predict score lines, all the way through to looking at tracking data to try and measure and value the space that players find themselves in. And my motivation there was to try and say, look, this stuff, first of all, it's really interesting. Even if you're just a old-fashioned football fan, XG can tell you something interesting about the game. Tracking data can tell you something interesting about the game. And I also wanted to demonstrate that you don't need to know any mathematics or have any sort of technical background in order to appreciate the ideas of what we're trying to do. And I think that hadn't really been done from someone who's actually been through that process before. So that was also a motivation.
Cool. The title of the book, How to Win the Premier League, quite a provocative title, that from an academic.
Yeah, that's a bit tongue-in-cheek. I wanted to call it a treatise on various aspects of data analysis in association football, but my agent said the game was to sell books.
Yes.
So he suggested the title, and I said, well, do you really think that's a better title than mine? And he insisted that it was.
And number one in the Sunday Times bestsellers list.
Oh, was it? Right.
The week it came out. Yeah, fantastic. And thoroughly deserved as well. Yeah, absolutely brilliant. I get contacted on a very regular basis by people saying, and I've no idea what it is, I'd really like your job. I'm fascinated by football finance. And I'll go, get yourself a life.
Yep.
But I'd imagine you must have the same degree of intrigue because you made such a contribution towards the success of Liverpool and Spurs, and it's what if somebody wanted to go into the field of data analytics in football, what skills do they need?
I think the two main skills are mathematical modelling and coding. So you can't get anywhere. When I started, you got like footballdata.co.uk. This guy called Joseph Buckdal has run it for years. That was one of the main sources of football data. And it was one row per game and about 20 or 30 columns of bookmakers' odds, shots, goals, corners, cards, and that sort of thing. With Excel and with like SPSS, some stats software, you could analyze that data without having to write a line of code. These days, with the complexity of event data and tracking data, you need to be able to write code. So learn Python or R, learn SQL, which is database querying language, because the data sets are so big. You need to put the data in a database and query it rather than just having the terrible spreadsheets that I grew up with and you still use. And then the other thing is mathematical modelling. So it's called data science these days. Learning regression and neural networks is really important. But I think as well as that, I'd say think about the game. Think about how the game works and how would you describe your theory of the game in terms of mathematics or in terms of statistics, because I see a lot of work these days which is just finding patterns in data, and the algorithms that come out of the box are really good at finding patterns in data. But to really understand the game, you've got to start from having an idea and having a theory about the game, and then the sort of coding and the models that you apply, they're just tools to help you understand and help you predict that game better. The worst thing from my point of view, and certainly from a sporting director's point of view, would be, a bright young coder comes up with an AI algorithm that says, I don't know, Coutinho is the best player for Barcelona. And as a sporting director, I say, well, tell me why you think Coutinho is the best player. And the answer is, well, my algorithm's a black box, but it told me he was the best, therefore he is the best. Think about the game, think about the interpretation of your data analysis. The other thing is there's a lot of data sets freely available. StatsBomb make a lot of data free. You can get your hands on tracking data for free as well. There's a guy called Devin Plula who works for Toronto FC, I think. He's written a really good primer on how to get started in football analytics, so that should be a first stop.
Cool, brilliant. Do you love football as much as you did when you were just a fan?
I like it. I love it more. I love the game more, but the business less. From the outside, transfers speculation is brilliant. From the inside, transfer speculation is awful, especially when you know you're not going to sign any players this summer, or you're just going to sign a squad player. But from the point of view of the game, I feel that my job and the sort of the models that we built at Liverpool, they've helped me understand the game in a way that football experts really understand the game. People that grew up with the game and have played it and can see that pass was on, or can see there's a problem with the way this team is setting up. I didn't know any of that when I used to watch games as a fan. I used to know a little bit about football, but I wouldn't pretend to be any sort of expert on it. And looking through the lens of data has allowed me to become an expert on it, to the point where, I can talk to clubs and recommend players to them, or suggest something that might be going wrong with the performance of the team.
Brilliant. And what are you doing now? Just one final question, but I know you've set up your own sort of is it consultancy? Is it Ludonautics? I believe is the name of the organisation. So what's the future for Ian Graham?
So I started Ludonautics last year, and the elevator pitch for it is we can do for your club what we did for Liverpool from a data point of view. The idea is it's like a outsourced data analysis department, and we can sort of guide teams through the transfer market, through understanding their performance through a lens of data, without having to put in that sort of 10-year investment that Liverpool did into it. The business is going really well. We've got a few clubs, got a few employees as well. So that's taken up all my time at the moment.
Brilliant. Ian, thank you so much for your time. As a fan of your work and as a fan of your book, it's been an absolute honour to have you on the show.
Oh, that's very kind. Thanks, Kieran. And I should say that I'm a fan of The Price of Football as well, and I do reference it in the most boring...
yeah, I showed it to my wife. Oh, God, I'm in Ian's book. Yes,
the most boring chapter of my book about football finances.
It's the most boring chapter of any book, I can quite assure you. Thank you so much.
All right, great to talk to you.
Kieran, my mind doesn't work like yours, so data...
That's good, Kevin. That's good. No, I take that as a positive.
It probably is. It's probably best that neither of our minds work like each other. But for me, data is not necessarily a tool that I would always be able to use, let's put it that way. You can put the figures in front of me, but I would struggle to analyse them. But my big... And it's not a criticism, because it would be churlish of me to say this, because I understand how important the numbers are. But if, for example, you look at the raw data of the Man City Arsenal game, and you looked at the XG of the second half, none of which would explain the sheer beauty of the Haaland goal, and none of which would explain that he should have been sent off for throwing the ball at somebody's head when he celebrated. A bit of shithousery, which is fantastic, but within the rules, definitely not allowed. So sometimes I think in this rush to understand data, you lose the big picture. But am I saying that, Kieran, purely because I would struggle to interpret data that's put in front of me?
No, I don't think that is the case. Listening to what Ian had to say, he is still a football fan first, and I think he's a Liverpool fan. So to get the job as head of research and to be able to use his skills, he's got a PhD, and to work with people to say, we've grown up, we are men of a certain age, we've grown up with a certain type of football, and we assume that it works because we don't know any different. But sometimes it's useful to be able to take a step away and to say, this works if you put it along. If you put X alongside Y, it doesn't work. If you put X alongside G, it does work, and you start to build up relationships. And we are now... football isn't a computer game, and what you said about the Manchester City Arsenal game is the perfect proof of that, because it still is so incredibly emotional. But there is a science as well as an art to football, and I think what Ian and his colleagues have done is they've been able to take advantage of the fact that we are now able to produce lots and lots of numbers. And then his genius and that of his colleagues is to work out which numbers are the important ones, what is generating success, what is not, to have an edge. Because if football is just going to be a finance game, and ironically, given the nature of this show, that's the last thing that I want, it all of a sudden becomes really, really boring. If it's just going to be, well, if you allowed one club to have more money than another, it can pay the highest wage bills, pay the highest transfer fees, and it automatically wins the Premier League or La Liga or whatever it's going to be, football would be very, very boring. So what Ian has done and what other data scientists have done and analysts is that they have taken that raw data and they have started to identify how they can get an edge without being the biggest kids in the room in terms of budget and so on. You still need to have a big budget. The Premier League this season is going to be won by one of the clubs with the top 6 budgets, and the chances are that the clubs that get relegated are going to be having the lowest budgets, and in between, there's some people that will overperform and there will be some people that will underperform, and that's part of the beauty of the game, and that has to be maintained within football, because if it's not, then there's no point in any of us going. You still believe at the start of August, as do I, if that player is as good as we hope it's going to be and they have recruited well, perhaps we could get into Europe. Perhaps we could have a good cup run, and that keeps us going. Even though deep down 99% of us believes it's going to be the usual suspects winning the usual trophies, and that's all the media care about, and we're just there to make up the numbers.
We've had this discussion before, Kieran, in terms of Tony Bloom. And indeed, in terms of you, because I feel sometimes that I do data analysts like Tony Bloom and yourself and Ian Graham a disservice, because I don't understand it. I just assume that what happens is that people like you can look at data, and it's almost like there's a mental highlighter pen in your head. It will leap out at you straight away. But in fact, what people are doing, it's much deeper than that. I mean, people are actually poring over this stuff for days and weeks. It's not as easy as there's a bargain to be had, or there's something we can exploit. You have to find it. You have to research it. You have to get the data in the first place, and then you have to look for those tiny differences that may make all the difference on the pitch in the end.
That's right, and these are tiny differences, but that's how matches are won and lost. It is one thing that we've spotted in our analysis of how they defend, and we've looked at the data and we look, that particular defender always does this little run when defending a corner, and we think we can therefore put somebody on the other side of him who can get a goal. And you look at the number of goals that Arsenal score, for example, through set pieces. That's come as a result of, yes, they've got a specialist corner taker, but they've done their analytical work as well. And it is a marrying of science and tactics and technique and the X factor, which makes us come back to football week after week.
Yeah. Thank you to everyone who's donated to the pod via our Patreon page. If you'd like to make a small monthly contribution as well, that'd be very kind of you. It will get you access to our chat community and our regular quizzes. Christmas quiz coming up, don't forget. You can do that by going to patreon.com/priceoffootball. If you have a question you'd like answered on the show, email us at questions@priceoffootball.com. You can follow us on Twitter, X, and find us on our YouTube channel. And if you'd like to buy our book, which is just out in paperback this week, you can find details on our website, priceoffootball.com. Bye, everybody.
Bye.